The first explosion hit Mercer Avenue at 11:47 on a Thursday night. Darian Voss felt it before he heard it, a pressure wave that moved through the church basement walls and rattled every glass instrument on his tray. Ceiling dust came down first. Then the second blast. Closer. The stained glass above the stairwell cracked straight down the center. Then the screaming started. He was already moving. Outside, the financial district had swallowed itself. 3 vehicles burned in the intersection, fire pushing 40 feet into the rain and turning it to steam before it hit the street. Armed men moved through smoke with practiced calm, not chaos to them. A job. Police sirens screamed from 6 blocks east and stayed 6 blocks east. Nobody crossed the perimeter. That wasn't fear keeping them back. That was a phone call. Darian worked the scene fast. A man down near the overturned newsstand, leg wound, pressure applied. A teenager locked rigid under the bus shelter, hyperventilating, talked down until his breathing slowed. An older man against a concrete pillar with his arm at an angle that turned Darian's stomach before he'd even knelt. He moved through all of them. And then he nearly stepped on the body collapsed against the sealed subway entrance. Long legs folded at wrong angles. An expensive suit, the kind that cost more than 3 months of Darian's rent. Soaked black with blood from somewhere below the ribs. Jaw split along the left side. One hand still gripped something that wasn't there anymore. The man had been shot multiple times and had kept moving anyway. Darian almost kept walking. He should have kept walking. But the man's eyes opened. Gray. Deep. Impossibly focused for someone bleeding out at midnight on a burning street. Those eyes tracked once and locked onto Darian with the calculation of someone who is never genuinely surprised by anything. Then the hand came up and closed around Darian's wrist. Iron grip. Don't let them take me back. Not a plea. Not fear. A command, from someone who still believed he had the authority to give them. Every signal said leave. The tactical vest barely visible under the torn jacket. No identification anywhere. The controlled stillness of a man who'd absorbed serious damage before and learned, through practice, to manage pain without showing it. None of it mattered. Darian Voss had spent 7 years running underground emergency clinics in districts the city pretended didn't exist. He'd treated people that corporate hospitals turned away at the intake desk. Saving whoever was in front of him had stopped being a decision a long time ago. It was the only thing that had ever made him feel necessary. So he got his arms under the stranger and dragged him through the side door of St. Orlan's Church. Hi viewers. If a dying stranger grabbed your wrist in a war zone and said, "Don't let them take me back," would you stop? Or keep walking? Drop your answer in the comments right now. I want to know. Behind them, across the burning intersection, a line of black SUVs turned silently onto Mercer Avenue. No sirens. No lights. Moving at a slow and deliberate pace. Like something that already knew exactly where to look. Darian didn't see them. He was already inside. The door was already closed. And whatever his life had been before that moment was already finished. The man didn't speak for most of the first day. He drifted between fever and silence while Darian worked, stitching, flushing wounds, monitoring vitals on equipment held together with tape and determination. 3 gunshot wounds, all close range. Entry angles that didn't say running. He'd been moving towards something when the shots landed. Covering someone. Or charging. He never asked where he was. Never panicked. Never explained. He just watched. Every time Darian moved around the room, those gray eyes followed without moving his head. Not afraid. Not grateful. Measuring. Like Darian was data being gathered and stored. By the second morning, Darian turned on the corner television just to interrupt the silence. The headline had already cycled twice. Sovereign Circle leadership crisis deepens following suspected assassination of billionaire figurehead Cassian Mire. A photograph beneath the text. Formal. Designed to project power rather than personality. Darian recognized the face immediately. He went completely still. Then he walked back into the treatment room and looked at the man on his table. Cassian Mire looked back at him. Fever down by half. Eyes clear and fully present. He'd been awake long enough to hear the television. He knew exactly what Darian had just seen. And he was waiting, patient, composed, entirely still, to see what Darian would do with it. Darian picked up the antibiotic syringe. "You need a second dose," he said. Cassian said nothing. "Your right side is still showing early infection. If I don't stay ahead of it tonight, you'll be back in crisis by morning." Still nothing. Darian administered the dose. Changed the dressings. Did everything exactly as he would for any patient in any situation. When he finished, Cassian spoke for the first time. "Why didn't you leave me to die?" Low voice. Damaged by blood loss and silence. But the weight underneath it was completely intact. The weight of a man who has never asked a question without already knowing the most likely answer. "I'm a doctor," Darian said. "It's not optional." Cassian was quiet a moment. "For most people," he said, "it becomes optional quickly. When the person dying is me." Darian didn't answer. Because he didn't have one that was honest. What he had, and refused to examine, was the awareness that he'd already recognized this man's face on that street. He'd known. And made the choice anyway. That said something about Darian Voss he wasn't ready to look at directly yet. "You should sleep," he said, moving toward the door. "I don't sleep in unfamiliar places." "Then rest. Your body needs it whether you cooperate or not." He was almost through the doorway. "You speak to the injured children differently than the adults." Darian stopped. Turned. "You noticed that?" Those gray eyes didn't blink once. "I notice everything, Darian." He had never told Cassian his name. Chapter 3. Eli arrived 4 nights later wrapped in a foil emergency blanket, making no sound at all. A city outreach worker Darian trusted brought him just after midnight. 6 years old, with enormous dark eyes that had seen something they weren't built to hold and had responded by shutting completely down. Eli hadn't spoken since the night they found him at the warehouse on Fletcher Street. The news called it a fire investigation. Darian knew what it was. Trafficking. Dismantled hard and fast. Eli was the only child recovered alive. Darian made him a bed in the back storage room. Brought soup Eli mostly stared at. Sat beside him reading from a medical reference book, the only text available, because the flat rhythm of it seemed to slow the boy's breathing towards something close to rest. When Darian returned to the main room, Cassian had moved. Sitting upright in the chair by the east window. 3 men Darian had never seen before stood along the far wall. They'd come in while Darian was with Eli, and none of them had made a sound doing it. "You need to be horizontal," Darian said. "I need information." Cassian's gaze moved to the back hallway. "The child. Not your concern. Everything in this building is my concern. This is my clinic. And you are currently inside my protection. No heat. No volume. Just certainty, flat and absolute. Which means every variable that could compromise that is information I need. He is a 6-year-old boy who watched people get killed. He is a witness connected to 3 active trafficking networks looking for reasons to come through that door." Cassian's voice didn't shift. "That makes him a problem that doesn't disappear because we want it to. So what exactly are you suggesting?" Cassian looked at him. Didn't answer. Turned back to the window. He didn't tell his men to move the boy. Didn't demand anything else. Just returned to whatever he'd been calculating before Darian walked in, contained, unreachable, behind whatever wall he kept between himself and everything he didn't allow himself to feel. That night, passing the storage room, Darian stopped. Eli was asleep. A new blanket tucked around him, wool, expensive dark gray. Darian hadn't put it there. One of Cassian's men sat outside the door reading a folded newspaper. Not hovering. Just present. A fixed point between the boy and whatever might come down the hallway. Darian stood there for a while. He was trying to work out what to do with the knowledge that a man whose name made police commissioners resign had quietly stationed a guard outside a traumatized child's room without announcing it. Without asking for anything back. Without letting it be a thing that required response. He didn't work it out. He went back to his supply inventory. But something had already shifted. Small. Specific. The kind you don't notice until you look back and realize it was the moment everything changed direction. 3 weeks in, Hollow City started pulling apart at the joints. Banks locked accounts with no notice. 2 district council members disappeared on the same Tuesday. A police commissioner resigned citing health reasons, and nobody with working instincts believed a word of it. Rival syndicate families moved through territory they'd never been bold enough to touch before, running on the assumption that the sovereign circle had gone leaderless. They were wrong. Every night, from a folding table in an underground church clinic, Cassian Mire rebuilt his empire the way a man rebuilds anything he considers temporarily interrupted. Men twice his size bowed their heads in that basement. Burner phones rang at all hours. Maps spread across Darian's examination table. Names disappeared from lists in handwriting that never hesitated. And then Cassian would turn around. And he would be watching Darian. Not calculating. Not assessing. Just watching, the way a person looks at something they are quietly terrified of losing before they've admitted they want it. He knew how Darian took his tea, same mug, steeped long, nothing added, and it would be waiting on the instrument table without a word. He noticed when Darian forgot to eat and food appeared. He once stood up in the middle of a meeting with 3 of his senior men and crossed the entire room because Darian had flinched at a raised voice near the doorway. Nobody in that room said a word about it. Nobody dared. Darian started building explanations around week 4. Circumstance. Proximity. Stress hormones misfiring in close quarters. He stacked them carefully between himself and the truth, which was that he had started noticing when Cassian wasn't in the room before he noticed anything else. That specific footsteps on stone had become something his body recognized before his mind caught up. That was the actual danger. Not the city falling apart outside. Not the men with guns. Not the target painted quietly on his back the moment he dragged Cassian through that church door. The danger was attachment. Slow. Specific. The kind that doesn't announce itself. Then the sniper round came through the east window. Glass exploded inward while Darian was cataloging instruments. His body hit the floor before the thought formed, flat between the supply cabinet and the wall, glass in his hair, heart slamming against the stone beneath him. Then Cassian was there. Not running. Not ducking. Standing directly between Darian and the broken window with the automatic placement of someone whose body had stopped waiting for instructions from his brain a long time ago. He looked down at Darian on the floor. His expression didn't change. "Are you hurt?" "No," Darian said. Cassian reached down. His hand was completely steady. He pulled Darian upright, held his wrist for 3 seconds, measuring his pulse, and released him. "You're fine," he said. Then he turned to his men. And Darian watched every soft thing leave his face at once. Darian didn't stay to watch what happened next. He took Eli to the back room and sat on the floor in the dark with the boy pressed against his side. Sounds moved through the church above them, short, efficient, the kind of violence that finishes fast because it was built to. Eli went completely still against Darian's ribs. Not shaking. waiting. Like a child who had already learned that stillness was the safest available option. When it stopped, the silence had a different weight than silence usually carries. Cassian came back downstairs. His cuffs were dark again. He sat across from Darian in the low light, and said nothing for a long time. He didn't look satisfied. He didn't look troubled. He looked like a man who had been running on the same fuel so long he'd lost clear memory of what he used to run on before. "You're safe," he said. Darian looked at him. Really looked. "Does it ever stop feeling like the only answer?" Darian said. "Or does it just keep asking for more of itself until there's nothing left of the person giving it?" Silence stretched. Not evasion, something more honest. The silence of someone turning a question over that they've never let themselves hold long enough to answer. "I don't know," Cassian said finally. "I've never stopped long enough to check." 3 days later, the suppressant failure happened with no warning. Darian heard it first. A sound from the corridor that wasn't quite pain and wasn't quite aggression and didn't fit any clean category. Something involuntary. A system losing its regulation. When he opened the door, Cassian was against the far wall. Both palms flat against the stone. Breathing at twice its normal rate. Radiating heat Darian could feel from 6 feet away. Every muscle in visible tension. His eyes, when they found Darian's, had the fixed quality of someone fighting something internal with the last available bandwidth. "Don't come closer," Cassian said. 3 words stripped to bone. No authority left. Just effort. "Cassian. My supply network was compromised. 6 years of medication. Gone." His jaw locked. Opened again. "I cannot hold the instinct override right now. I am asking you to stay back." Darian understood the mechanism. Rare but documented. A physiological dependency on synthetic suppressants that, when suddenly removed, triggered escalating instinct responses the individual couldn't consciously govern. Not aggression. The body locked in a loop with no exit it could find alone. He also understood something that had nothing to do with medicine. Cassian was using the last organized language he had to warn him. Not to protect himself. Because he was more afraid of what might happen to Darian than of anything happening to himself. Darian walked forward anyway. "Don't," Cassian said. "You already know what I'm going to say." "Darian. Don't." Darian pressed his palm flat against the center of Cassian's chest. The heartbeat underneath was nearly double rate. The tremors were deep and structural, coming from somewhere that had been under sustained pressure for a very long time. The heat off his skin was extraordinary. Then everything stopped. Not resolved. Not gone. Cut, like a signal interrupted mid-frequency. Cassian's eyes locked onto Darian's face and went still. His breathing began its long crawl back towards something manageable. Not because of any medication. Not because of anything in the room. Because of one hand on his chest. The silence after that was the most significant silence of Darian's life. Cassian's head lowered slowly. Forehead nearly touching Darian's. His voice, when it came, had almost no sound left in it. "You calmed something inside me that was never supposed to survive this long." Darian didn't move. Didn't answer. His hand stayed exactly where it was, over a heartbeat finding its way back to rhythm, and he made a deliberate choice not to go near what that sentence had just done to him. He didn't trust himself yet. The man who entered Hollow City 2 weeks later wore his reputation like a clean shirt. Lucien Arden. Public prosecutor. 4 years of syndicate cases built in the public eye. Press photographs outside community health centers. Speeches about accountability on 3 separate channels. Clean hands. Loud record. The kind of man a city reaches for when everything else is rotting. Darian needed something uncomplicated. He told himself that when he agreed to meet. The district health office was neutral ground. Lucien sat with the relaxed posture of someone accustomed to being trusted in rooms. He asked precise questions about clinic structure, about patient protection gaps, about legal coverage for undocumented zone medical workers. Good questions. Prepared questions. Darien found himself answering fully. Then Lucien's eyes dropped to the ID badge on Darien's coat. To the surname. Something moved through Lucien's face, fast, controlled instantly after. But Darien had spent years reading crisis expressions. The ones that appear in the split second before the managed version replaces them. He caught it. Vale, Lucien said. Easy. Smooth. Your father, Dr. Emmett Vale? He died when I was 9. I was raised in foster care. Of course. Warmth returned immediately. What you've built is remarkable. Carrying that name into medicine the way you have. Darien nodded. Smiled at the right moment. But he kept one word from that sentence long after the meeting ended and he was walking home alone through wet streets. Carrying. Not honoring. Not building on. Carrying. Like weight. Like something placed on him before he understood what it was. The drive Cassian set on the instrument table had no label. No explanation either. Just placed it there one morning and said quietly, "You should understand what you're holding before someone else decides to use it against you." Darien read the files at 3 in the morning. Supply room. Eli asleep on the other side of the wall. A single work light casting yellow across the table. His father's name was on 17 documents. Research authorizations. Payment records. Clinical design protocols spanning 8 years. An illegal suppressant experimentation program run on Omega designation children in state custody, children without family representation, without anyone positioned to ask questions when the trials left damage that didn't appear on standard assessments. 3 primary funders. His father's medical foundation. 2 shell corporations. He traced the corporate structure for 40 minutes before the second set of names emerged. Lucien Arden. He sat with that for a long time. Then he pulled the patient intake records. 11 minutes to find the file. Subject age at entry, 8 years old. Alpha Omega hybrid designation, selected because the program studied suppression response in hybrid biology. No family name. Subject number only. Supervising physician's notation at month 4. Subject demonstrates atypical psychological resilience. Refuses behavioral modification. Continued inclusion presents liability exposure. Recommend discontinuation. Final status, released. Whereabouts not tracked. Entry date, 30 years prior. Eye color listed as winter gray. Darien stopped breathing. The empire. The violence. The absolute controlled power of the sovereign circle. None of it had started with ambition. It had started with an 8-year-old boy given a number instead of a name who refused every attempt to make him compliant, got released into nothing when he stopped being useful data, and survived anyway. And built something that made entire cities afraid to say his name. Footsteps in the corridor. Cassian appeared in the doorway. He always knew when Darien was awake somewhere unexpected. He looked at the open drive on the table. Either of them spoke for a moment. "You should have told me," Darien said. "No, Cassian. If I told you first, you would have spent months under the weight of something that was done to both of us before either of us could choose anything." His voice was quiet. Level. "You needed to find it yourself. So you'd know it wasn't yours to carry. I feel like it is anyway." "I know." He crossed the room. Sat across from Darien. "That's because you are not what they built with your name." Darien looked at his hands. Steady. Trained. "My whole career was funded by." "Your hands pulled me off a burning street," Cassian said. "Not comfort." A fact. Everything you've built with them is yours. Everything they did belongs to them alone. The silence that followed had a different texture. Not distance. Not standoff. Something that felt, for the first time, like the beginning of being genuinely seen. Then Darian stood to check on Eli. He pushed open the storage room door. Empty. The blanket on the floor. The small shoes, the ones they'd bought 9 days ago, sitting side by side against the wall exactly where Eli always left them before climbing into bed. Left behind. Darian's body understood it before his mind finished the sentence. He turned around. Cassian was already at the door. Jaw set in a way Darian had never seen before. Not controlled. Not managed. Burning. Chapter 8. The 40 minutes that followed don't exist accurately in any official record. 3 warehouse fires in the harbor district. A financial building connected through layered shell companies to trafficking infrastructure experienced structural failure. 14 officials with documented ties to Lucien Arden's network had their private communications published simultaneously across every major news platform. 3 syndicate operations that believed themselves politically protected discovered the protection was gone. Cassian moved through all of it with the focused efficiency of a man who had removed the question of cost from the equation entirely. He brought Eli back just before dawn. Handed him to Darian at the church entrance, and stood in the doorway while rain blew in from the harbor. He didn't speak for several minutes. Just stood and breathed. Eli's face was buried against Darian's shoulder, both hands gripping the front of his coat. The boy's breathing was ragged but slowing. He was okay. Darian held him and watched Cassian's hands at his sides. They were shaking. Not from wounds. From something that had surfaced through 48 hours of controlled violence, and arrived as the thing it had always been underneath. The grief of a man who had been 8 years old and unclaimed and terrified once, and had decided on some wordless level that he would dismantle everything in reach before he let that happen to someone else. "He's okay," Darian said quietly. Cassian nodded once. "You're going to keep going after this," Darian said. "Keep answering everything the same way until—" "Yes. Until there's nothing left to protect because you've taken everything else with you." Cassian looked at him. "I know what I am." "I know you do." Darian passed Eli gently toward the interior and then crossed the space between himself and Cassian without pausing. "But fear is not protection. It's isolation with a different name. And the version of you that operates on fear alone doesn't keep any of us safe. It just keeps you alone." Silence. Rain heavier now. There are people still alive in Lucien's network who had no real choice about being there. If you go all the way, some of those people die for decisions they didn't make. I need you to hear that. Cassian's jaw tightened. The old math ran hard behind his eyes. The calculation that had kept him alive for 30 years by treating mercy as a liability. Then something in it stopped. Not defeat. A choice. Made deliberately, from a place he'd almost lost access to. "If I stop..." The sentence didn't finish. Darian finished it. "Will you stay?" Cassian went completely still. "Will you?" he said. "Yes," Darian said. "Yes." And he meant it in every direction those words could possibly travel. Lucien Arden moved the moment he felt the ground going. 72 hours after the harbor, he released a full formal document to every press outlet. Naming Cassian as sole architect of the violence, requesting emergency arrest authority, placing himself in front of every available camera as the last moral structure standing in Hollow City. It was fast. Well constructed. And built entirely on the assumption that Darian would want distance from Cassian after seeing his father's name on those files. Lucien had calculated wrong. He hadn't accounted for what 4 months of learning the difference between inheritance and choice looks like when it settles into a person's bones. Darian stood before the full city council. He put every document on the public record. His father's name, Lucian's name, the shell corporations, the clinical protocols, the patient intake records, the children, numbered, unnamed, untracked. All of it, laid out in the flat, precise language of a man who understood that this was the most important moment, to be exact, that he would ever have. The chamber went completely quiet. Lucian Arden sat at the far end of the table and did not move. The particular stillness of a man counting exits and finding each one closed. Afterward, in the courthouse corridor, his voice came from behind Darian's left shoulder. "You've ended yourself," Lucian said. Quiet. The last tool he had left. "No institution in this city will work with you again." Darian turned. Cassian was 4 feet behind him. He hadn't arrived loudly. He was simply present, the way significant weight is present in a room, and every person in the corridor had shifted without being asked, opening space around him the way people do when something large moves through a crowd. He didn't look at Lucian. He looked at Darian. And then, in a full courthouse corridor, in front of staff and press and cameras and a city that had spent years deciding who Cassian Mire was, he knelt. One knee on the floor. Head lowered briefly. No theater. No announcement. A man with the kind of power that does not bend, choosing to bend. Completely. Quietly. Because he decided to. Because Darian had earned it. Because some things are too large to acknowledge while standing. When he rose, his eyes found Darian's and held them. "You were the first person," he said, low enough that only Darian could hear, "who looked at me and saw something that could still be human." Darian put his hand against the side of Cassian's face. "Right there. In front of all of it." "I didn't see potential," Darian said. "I saw evidence." Months passed. Hollow City didn't become clean. Cities built on layered corruption don't clean themselves, they shift. But certain things began to change in ways that held. Underground clinics received anonymous funding that arrived consistently, and in real amounts. Enough to move above ground, licensed and properly staffed, operating the way Darian had always known they could if someone decided they mattered enough to invest in. Foster protection legislation cleared 3 successive committee reviews that had rejected identical proposals for 11 straight years. Trafficking networks that had operated under permanent political cover found the cover pulled. And without it, began coming apart district by district, quietly, without headlines that would require anyone powerful to make a public statement. Justice didn't look the way Darian had been taught to expect it. Sometimes it arrived in documents and testimony, and the slow grind of institutional accountability. Sometimes it arrived before dawn in the form of men moving carefully through unlit streets, and by morning the active threat register was shorter, and no one with any real understanding of the city asked for a detailed accounting. Both kinds. Sometimes in the same week. That was the part no official version of the record was ever going to be fully honest about. Eli began speaking again in the 3rd month. Single words first. Careful, tested, like he was checking whether they'd be received before committing. Then short phrases. Then full sentences delivered with the particular caution of a child who had learned to extend trust in small amounts until the evidence justified more. His first complete unprompted sentence came over breakfast on a Tuesday. He looked across the table at Darian and asked, without any preamble, "Are we going to stay here?" Darian said yes. Eli nodded once. The nod of someone receiving confirmation of something they'd already halfway decided to believe, and returned to the drawing he'd been working on for 2 weeks. It covered most of a large sheet of paper, a dark building with lit windows, 2 figures standing outside it, and surrounding the entire scene, rendered in thorough crayon strokes, what could only be described as an extremely deliberate protective wall. Darian brought it to the kitchen that evening. Cassian looked at it for a long time. Something moved through his face, slow, careful, entirely unguarded in a way Darian had only seen a handful of times. He set the drawing on the counter with more care than he used for almost anything else in the building. "He made us a house," he said. "He made us a family," Darian said. That word sat between them in the kitchen light. Neither of them moved to qualify it. Outside, the city moved through an early gray morning. Complicated and slowly, imperfectly working towards something different. Guards changed shifts in the courtyard without incident. Somewhere upstairs, Eli was narrating an elaborate game to himself in a voice that was still careful, still testing its own volume, but learning day by day that the room would hold it. Cassian was quiet for a moment. Then, low, "You can still leave." Not a test. Not a warning. Just honesty. The raw kind that only surfaces after a person stops being afraid of what the answer might mean. Darian looked at him. The man who had been a weapon forged from someone else's cruelty, and a wound that never fully closed, and somewhere inside all of that had become the most specific, inconvenient, irreversible thing that had ever entered Darian's life. "No," he said. "I really can't." Cassian didn't smile. He wasn't built for easy expressions. But something in him settled. Deep and structural, the quality of a foundation that has finally stopped waiting to fail. Darian turned to reach for his tea. Already made. Already waiting. Right mug, steeped exactly right, nothing added. Of course it was. He had stopped pretending not to notice that a long time ago. Standing in the quiet of a kitchen that smelled like coffee and old stone, and something that had decided slowly and without announcement to call itself home. Darian Voss let himself believe something he had never quite allowed before. He had thought he was saving a stranger from a burning street. He had not understood, until now, that the stranger had been teaching him something the entire time. In every quiet and specific and difficult way possible. That surviving is not the same thing as living. That love, the real kind, the inconvenient and dangerous and completely non-optional kind, does not arrive looking like safety. It arrives looking like a man who has never once in his life needed anyone. Reaching for your wrist anyway. And refusing to let go.